All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is our lecture for Chapter 5, Part 1. Okay, so hopefully you have all your stuff in front of you, you're ready to go, and I'm just gonna get into it, all right? Okay, let's see, Chapter 4, we left off talking about, well, the first half of Chapter 4 was about the growth of slavery in the colonies. And then the second half of Chapter 4 was about growing animosity amongst our colonists towards the British Crown, okay? That's pretty much where we're going to build off of today, and then this will launch us into the American Revolution, okay? So, Chapter 5, the American Revolution. Let's see, 1763, and we will go until 1783. Alrighty, this picture is of the Boston Massacre, so whenever I get to that point in our story, we'll come back to this image, okay? All right. The crisis begins. Okay, George III takes the throne in Britain in 1760. Wow, did I miss that point, or will we get to it? So it's at this point that Britain becomes, no, I guess we haven't gotten to that yet. We will soon become the United Kingdom, but okay. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so George III takes the crown of Britain in 1760. His mentality was that the colonies were subordinates. And this kind of goes back to what we've been talking about before, the idea of salutary neglect, where the colonies were left, to govern themselves. Now they're being seen as subordinates. So depending on who's in power, it kind of determines the status of the colonists, okay? He believed that their main role was to enrich the mother country. So all of these new goods that are coming out of the New World, he felt like that was for the benefit of Britain, okay? Not to create an economy of their own, okay? Like I said, he feels that the colonists are subordinates and begins imposing taxes to pay for the wars, the imperial wars that are going on. So that, again, hits back on what we were saying before. There's a rise in taxes to build up the military, the army, and the navy, okay? All right, nearly all British political leaders supported this taxation, and it kind of became, it was pretty popular of an idea that the colonists should be grateful for the protection of the British Crown. Okay, we talked about the 7 Years' War last time, known as the French and Indian War to the British. So the 7 Years' War, it cost 150 million pounds. So all of that, those taxes that we're talking about, went to that. This would equal tens of trillions of dollars today. And yeah, those in power felt like it was reasonable that the colonists should help fund these excursions, okay? All right, this brings us into the conversation of virtual representation, which we'll get into more, but this is the idea that the colonists are being represented in Parliament, but what is in their best interest isn't being reflected, all right? But so virtual representation is, this theory that they, as the people, they're represented by this one individual, all right? This is also problematic because some areas didn't even have representatives. So this will lead to further conversations about that. But really at this point in time, the colonists began challenging the concept of virtual representation. Okay, there's the Proclamation of 1763, which further barred settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, which we talked about before. Again, people are mad. They want to move west and get more land. All right, so people are starting to really get worked up about all of the stuff that is being imposed on them by British Parliament. So let's look at this next slide and talk about some of those taxes. So there's the Sugar Act that's passed in 1764. There's the Currency Act, again, 1764, and then the Stamp Act the following year. Basically, the Sugar Act strengthened the court system and messed up people's representation. This kind of played off of the Navigation Acts, which we've talked about, and really at this point in time, this affects port cities. Port cities will kind of be where all the action is happening. So later on, we'll talk about Boston, okay, Philadelphia. So the Currency Act, that went back to what we talked about last time. There was a ban on paper money. All right, this reaffirmed that. And then the Stamp Act goes back, you know, a couple generations to laws that had been in place saying that in order to have anything published and circulated, you have to have the special seal of approval from the Crown. This is the same thing, okay? This is the stamp. Now it's a stamp, all right? So now all printed materials have to have a stamp with it. So this applied to newspapers, books, court documents, commercial papers, land deeds, almanacs, everything, all right? Again, this was meant to fund military operations, and people are infuriated. So while the Sugar Act, you know, affected people in port cities, the Stamp Act, that's printed material, that's everybody, all right? So this one really, and the Currency Act. So those are taxes that affect more of society, all right? So more people will become outraged. Okay, so our next slide. By imposing the Stamp Act without colonial consent, Parliament directly challenged all of our local assemblies, all of our small colonial governments. And, well, like I just kind of said, this opposition to the Stamp Act is the first real drama of what will become the American Revolution. Like I said, this is affecting, you know, more people. This is a broader situation. Okay, so colonists viewed the empire as an association of equals, so they were not viewing themselves as subordinate as people in Britain were viewing them. Okay, they argued that they should enjoy the same rights as Britons at home across the pond. And Parliament, they tried to decide what to do, but they feared that backing down on this would set a dangerous precedent for the rest of the empire, meaning that other people would challenge laws and stipulations that were being imposed on them, would cause revolutions, blah, blah, blah. So basically they're like, no, we need to keep our foot down about this, okay? Okay. Taxation and representation. All right, right around this time, more and more colonists insisted that Britain had no right to tax them at all, since they were unrepresented in the House of Commons. So that virtual representation idea, okay, people start challenging that. What becomes the rallying cry of the revolution is no taxation without representation. And I'm sure you've all heard that before, but that's what that means, okay? They're not being represented in Parliament, then why should they be paying taxes for that to go back to that Parliament, okay? And really the whole concept behind no taxation without representation is promoting the idea of the right to be, to consent to be taxed, all right? This comes from Patrick Henry, which our book, Give Me Liberty, is also a Patrick Henry quote, give me liberty or give me death. That's where that comes from. But so he is a strong voice for the Revolutionary era, all right? So Patrick Henry drafts these resolutions that the colonists would, well, starting in Virginia, that Virginia colonists would adopt for themselves. So this is adopted by the Virginia House of Burgesses. Okay, and this brings us up to October of 1765. So our first Congress, so representatives from all of our colonies get together, and they are known as the Stamp Act Congress. Okay, they are acting out in retaliation to the Stamp Act. So they just keep it in their title. Okay, so the Stamp Act Congress met in New York to adopt what Virginia had just done, the no taxation without representation and Patrick Henry's ideals. So our Congress meets in New York to do this, and while doing so, they also reaffirmed their allegiance to the crown, okay? This is important to know because most colonists did not want to revolt and remove themselves from, the safety blanket of the British Empire, all right? So while meeting, they're saying, we deserve these rights and this is what we stand for. But also, we're not trying to start any beef with you. We're just trying to say that we deserve these basic necessities, okay? Okay, so to begin with, this is 9 colonies that get together and do this, represented by 27 delegates. And so this is the real or beginning of any organization of all the colonies as one group, okay? Which we'll get into that more, but okay. So some colonial merchants agreed to protest British goods because of the Stamp Act, and that creates this movement, which we'll see throughout the Revolution, but this push for, it's called homespun, but it's really anything that's made, colonial made goods as opposed to British made, okay? So making things at home, spinning and weaving your own fabric, making your own clothes, making your own utensils, basic necessities, growing your own food and relying on local goods, okay? So shop local is what that's basically about, okay? Okay, so looking at this next slide, this goes off of what I was just kind of saying, but this is the first creation of kind of a uniform group of colonists rather than all of our individual colonies, all right? So by imposing uniformity on the colonies rather than dealing with them individually, Parliament united America, all right? So rather than all of the colonists getting together and say, hey, let's create this alliance, Parliament just kind of addressed all colonists, like regardless of where you come from, you're just a colonist to us. So by doing that, the colonists then began viewing themselves as one group of people, AKA Americans, okay? So this is really when the idea of the American population comes up. Okay. They begin, we have our Stamp Act Congress. They begin creating other committees to address other issues. So there's the Committee of Correspondence. There are different groups coming about. So there's the Sons of Liberty, which begins in 1765, who led protests in New York City and encouraged boycotts of British goods, like I said. And so this next year, 1766, British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act because everyone was so upset. So they were like, okay, we'll back down. But just to let you know that we are still in control of you, and don't you forget it, they develop what's called the Declaratory Act, okay? So this rejected Americans' claims that only elected representatives could impose taxes on them, which sets the precedent of saying, okay, well, from here on out, any other taxes we impose on you guys, you can't really say anything about it. Okay, so this will set the tone for a war breaking out, all right? But, so let us see. All right, yeah, this next slide, the road to revolution, that's exactly where we are headed. Okay, I'm gonna drink before we get into this. Okay, we are in 1767. The Townshend Acts are imposed on our colonists. So going back to the Stamp Act, in opposing that, the colonists seemed to suggest that they would not object if Britain raised revenue by regulating trade, just as a broad concept, okay? Which is what Parliament plays on. They find this little wormhole to get through, okay? So this is what the Townshend Acts are. Okay. The Townshend Acts were a new set of taxes on goods that were imported into the colonies, and this also created a board of customs commissioners to oversee all of this and to collect those taxes. All right, so they're sending in British officials to the colonies, just to as project managers. All right. Okay, so several leaders in several colonies, I should say, reimposed the ban on British goods, and this begins in Boston. Like I said, Boston will be a big hub for us, okay? This appeals to all of our colonies, though. So regardless of, urban, rural, everybody gets behind this, and people start organizing and protesting, all right? The shop local movement, the homespun movement, just grows bigger and bigger as more people are saying, screw this, protest their goods, we can make this ourselves, don't worry about it. But so it's this reliance on American goods rather than British, and homespun clothing becomes the symbol of resistance. Okay, and the Anglo-European women who are responsible for really pushing this homespun movement. Those will also be the same women who are involved in making flags later on, so Betsy Ross, okay? But they are known as the Daughters of Liberty. Anyway, okay. But so it's this grassroots movement of protest against the British Crown at this point. Or at this point, the whole thing, I guess, all right? Okay, so this brings us up to the Boston Massacre. All right, like I said, they're sending in royal troops to oversee things in the colonies. So they were stationed in Boston in 1768 after rioting happens because of the seizure of this British ship called the Liberty, because it was violating the trade regulations. So these soldiers that are being stationed in our cities become more and more unpopular with the colonists, okay? So let's move forward a little bit. We're now in March of 1770, okay, still in Boston. And there is a fight that breaks out between a crowd of Bostonians, mostly, teenage boys, throwing snowballs, and British troops, that it escalated into an armed confrontation and left 5 Bostonians dead, okay? The commanding officer and 8 soldiers were tried. 7 were found not guilty and 2 were convicted. And this is what our cover photo is about, because this is the image that so this was done by Paul Revere. You can go ahead and scroll back to the front if you want and look at that. But so this is the image we have of the Boston Massacre. And if you guys notice on the syllabus, if we had still been meeting in class, we would watch the first episode of John Adams. If you can find that anywhere, it is good to watch, and everyone always ends up enjoying it. But John Adams ended up being a lawyer for these soldiers in Boston during this. And so HBO, it was like 2008, I do believe, did a mini series about John Adams. Paul Giamatti played him, and it shows this whole thing playing out. You know, it's 2008, so things have been pretty well researched at this point, and the way the massacre plays out, I feel like seeing that and knowing that it has been researched by historians, I feel like it's different than what I had always envisioned. So if you guys can watch it, do recommend. Yeah, every time we watch it in class, I always have a couple of people who end up like watching the whole mini series because they're like, I just wanted to finish it because it was great. So if you guys can watch it, like I said, do recommend, not mandatory. Yeah, but HBO series, so you can just look up John Adams HBO series plus streaming and see where it is out there. Okay, so that is the Boston Massacre. But so this armed conflict where these soldiers end up opening fire on this crowd of Bostonians, this causes a lot of anger, all right? Not only are they sending British troops there, but they're attacking people now, okay? So this just increases our organization of protest. Okay. So this brings us to the Tea Act. All right, we're still in 1770. The non-importation movement, so all of this protest against British goods, had essentially collapsed just because there were some things that they had to bring in from Britain. This was also, I don't want to say arranged, but it was supported by British merchants that, you know, our Townshend Acts be repealed and encourage colonists to just start buying British again, basically, okay? So they repealed the Townshend Acts, leaving only one tax in place. This was the Tea Act. They also agreed to remove troops from Boston. So this was after the Boston Massacre. And so as a compromise, American merchants abandoned the boycott, okay? Alrighty, we have the East India Company, which had a trading monopoly at the time and was doing very well in regards to their stock, and that all collapses. So they're left with this abundance of tea, and they have to figure out what to do with it. So to stimulate sales, the British government offered the company a series of rebates and tax exemptions, and through that they also came up with this agreement to send all that surplus tea to the colonies. Okay. Which they would have to pay taxes on, right? So the colonists insisted that to pay taxes on tea would acknowledge Britain's right to tax them. And as tea begins arriving in the colonies, our resistance just grows, okay? And this is what leads to the Boston Tea Party incident. It was on December 16th, 1773, when a group of colonists disguised as Indigenous Americans, which is very problematic, boarded 3 ships at anchor in Boston Harbor and threw more than 300 chests of tea into the water. So this ended up costing the East India Company 10,000 pounds, which would be the equivalent of over $4 million today. And as a result of that, British Parliament then retaliates. All right. There is then the passage of what are known as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, as they're known to the colonists, in 1774. And this really united the colonists in opposition to British Parliament. All right. Parliament then closed the port of Boston to all trade until the tea was paid for. They curtailed any town meetings and authorized the governor to appoint members to the council. So again, bringing in British officials. Let's see. Yeah, these were positions that were previously filled by election. Okay, and then it also empowered military commanders to lodge soldiers in private homes. So whenever you hear in the Declaration of Independence this whole thing about quartering soldiers, People now are like, well, why do we even have that anymore? No, we're not quartering soldiers. This is where it comes from, all right? They were then speaking out against what had just been imposed on them, okay? Okay, and then this takes us back to the Ohio River Valley, which we had, I guess, ended chapter 4 with. Okay, so there's the Quebec Act. Remember, there was the boundary issue in Ohio. This is what starts the 7 Years' War. So British territory butting up next to French territory, all right? So the Quebec Act extended the southern border of the Canadian province near the Ohio River and granted religious toleration to the Catholic Church in Canada. Think about all of our British Protestants. They take that as a direct attack on them and their way of life, saying, oh, well, you're acknowledging you're acknowledging the Catholic Church and saying that you tolerate them? What? Okay. And yeah, so this persuaded many colonists that the British government was actually conspiring to strengthen Catholicism. Okay, there's always a conspiracy theory, right? Okay, so this is where we're going to leave off today. We have our camel, and we are dropping a piece of straw, which is the Quebec Act, and we'll see where it lands, okay? All right, if you guys have any questions about anything, please shoot me an email. I'm around, and I will be back later with the second half of chapter 5. All right, have a good one. Bye.